good afternoon, everyone. And thank you both for the introduction, especially thanks to Mr. Yassimi for giving me this opportunity to present the work that I've been either involved to or I'm familiar with in the topic of energy poverty. Unfortunately, as has been said, the topic of energy poverty is becoming more and more relevant due to the COVID-related crisis that's just happening, or as we hope has happened in the last few years, and even more with the changes in the energy prices and the ongoing situation in Ukraine. So anyhow, some of the data that I will be presenting are not up to date due to the fact that the last changes in the energy prices are not, let's say, formed as the final data that could be used for research yet. So when we look at it from the perspective of energy poverty, we can kind of conclude that the situation is even, let's say, worse than it will be presented in the presentation today. I am part of the Institute for European Energy and Climate Policy, which is, let's call it a think tank, an independent research foundation working since 2015. Mainly trying to base the European Union and European in general policies on the science we are working on in the areas of energy efficiency mostly, but also climate change and renewable energy policy. And although we are based in the Netherlands, formally we are spread around Europe. So in my case, I'm working from Croatia. And of course, we are trying to, as I said, help the European Union and the European countries in general in the formation of the energy policies that could be based on the current science knowledge. These are some of the projects, just an overview of them, so that you can follow if you're interested in some of the specific topics. Just a short figures on what we are working on. So let's go to the topic of today. I'm just going to say a bit about the energy poverty definition, and you can see here a lot of photos which are coming from the field research that I was working on with my colleagues and with a lot of students and volunteers earlier on in the Society for Sustainable Development Design. These are photos from energy poor households, either from Croatia or from the Western Balkan countries. So they show the situation in the field in our area of the world, mostly in the energy community countries, but also Croatia. As a beginning, let's try to kind of define energy poverty, although I guess we are all familiar that this might be the first problem or the first gap when talking about energy poverty, is that there is no common definition of the energy poverty. But starting from the poverty in general, we can kind of define the extreme poverty, which means people living in a very, very extremely poor circumstances, less than $1.9 per day. And when mentioned earlier on, the situation seemed to be going better from 2015 to 2021. And then COVID started, so the projections completely changed. And now we are in the optimistic situation, reaching the poverty levels of 2015, and in pessimistic, reaching even higher levels of poverty, of the general world poverty. So we are trying to kind of connect the definition of poverty and the definition of energy poverty. So as the example from Encyclopedia Britannica says, the poverty is the situation when someone lacks usual socially acceptable amount of money or material possessions. So the situation where there is a lack of means to satisfy the basic needs. And the definition of energy poverty is kind of linked to this definition, but specific for energy. So it's similar that someone is not able to have the acceptable amount of possessions. In this case, it's the essential energy services. So the Energy Poverty Observatory, which is now the Energy Poverty Hub, as from the European Commission, defines energy poor households as those that experience inadequate levels of essential energy services. And now we always come to this question, what does essential means? Because essential does not mean the same as Central Africa or in the European countries. So that is, I guess, rather clear to all of us. So what is the basic kind of difference between the energy poverty and the poverty in general is that the energy poverty could be broader. So there are people who are not generally poor, but they could be considered energy poor based on the different indicators. And that's why the energy poverty topic does not also only include the income poverty, which you can see on the picture on the bottom right, but also that it does include the vulnerability to the energy circumstances. For example, if we are considering the certain groups which are more vulnerable to the energy related conditions, you can see here the example of elderly people who are more vulnerable to the thermal comfort from one side, from their age, from the other side, from the amount of time they're spending indoors. This is also relevant, I don't know, for single parent families, for young children, for people with disabilities, and so on. So there are specific groups that are vulnerable due to their different circumstances. And then besides income and vulnerabilities, there is also a matter of energy costs, which is relevant. So as energy costs are changing, the part of the income that's dedicated to energy costs, energy expenditure is also changing. So this is also relevant the part or indicator of energy poverty. And then, of course, we have the status of the building, the energy and the thermal comfort which is available in the building, and the available energy services. This all together defines energy poverty. Even though a single definition does not exist, there are some working definitions from the European Commission. And you can see, for example, that one of them is that individuals and the households that are not able to adequately heat or provide other required energy services in their homes. This is like rather general definition, because then we come again to the question of what is required energy service and what is an affordable cost. So it has to be very specified for a specific country or specific circumstance. And then in the latest time, so a month ago, the Commission, with starting the Social Climate Fund, some of the members of the European Parliament had a suggestion of the more, let's say, specific definition, which would say households in the lowest income deciles for energy costs exceed median ratio between energy costs and disposable income after deduction of the housing costs. So this is very specific and country specific definition. This is, who is mute? Is it okay?
It's okay.
Is okay?
Yes, you can continue.
Sorry, I think someone muted me because I didn't touch anything. Sorry. So I don't know if you heard the last sentence, but it's the households in the lowest income decile whose energy cost exceeds median ratio between energy costs and disposable income after deduction of the housing costs. So this is a more specific and could be applied to specific circumstances and countries. So then we come back to the question of what does required energy service mean? As I said, it means differently based on the circumstances. And as previously said, trying to define the required service could be a bit more complex. So there is one of the definitions that says that it's the inability to heat a home to a socially and materially needed level. And that comes with impaired physical and mental health. So the consequence of the inadequate and not required inadequate services as compared to the required one results with physical and mental health problems. So you can see here an example from a case study in Croatia, in Sisak Moslavina country. This includes the evaluation of health meaning subjective and objective one. So the subjective evaluation and health is the answer to questions of how someone feels, what are the illnesses that they are suffering, and so on. And there are some objective questions like how many days did they spend in a hospital, and so on. And there is also a question of the mental health, so whether people are having some mental difficulties and if they are participating social life and so on. And you can see the difference between general population and the vulnerable consumers, and the fact that their quality of life, physical and mental health, is lower than in general population. The situational analysis, sorry, there's someone who's not muted. So the situational analysis shows how to measure what is not being defined. That means, as I said previously, there is not a clear definition of energy poverty, but we are trying to define, to measure the energy poverty, although not defined. So for that, the Energy Poverty Observatory has developed several indicators. And these indicators include, the first one includes the people who have a high share of energy expenditure in income. That means the part of the population with share of energy expenditure in income higher than 2 times of the national median. That means when, if you know that there are some definitions in different countries, like 10% of the income is dedicated for energy, or 20%, and so on, but this is not relevant for all the countries. So the general indicator would be comparable to the median, not to some absolute percentage. The second indicator is low general energy expenditure. This means that this is the population who actually spends a very low amount of expenditure for energy, lower than half of the national median. This means that they are in some way living in non-adequate circumstances, so that they're either not heating to the adequate level or they're not using adequate energy services, and that's why their expenditure is lower. The next one is, I think, very, very familiar. That's the inability to keep home adequately warm, and it's based on self-reported thermal discomfort, and is collected by the Eurostat for the EU-SILC survey. And you can see here on the left side the results from the mentioned study that was done by Energy Institute Hrve Požar and Dor for energy community, where there are also energy community countries included, and they are showing, for example, that Kosovo, North Macedonia, or Bulgaria are the countries which have a very high percentage of population which does not feel adequately warm in their households, but also the other countries in the energy community are stating below average ability to keep adequately warm. In most cases, when you can see from the right side pie graph, that this is from one of the also projects in Croatia, that most of these vulnerable consumers use single source heating systems, so they don't have central heating systems. So this is probably familiar to you, that it's mostly heating one room in the house, meaning that all the other rooms are experiencing, of course, not adequate warmness for example, winter period of the year. There is also an indicator of arrears on energy bills. That means an ability to pay the bills on time. And you can see here also the graph, which is not covering the energy community countries, but you can see in European Union that also Southern Eastern Europe is showing the most problems with the non-ability to cover the energy bills. And you can see here also the results from one of the studies done in Croatia, that for the vulnerable consumers, 80% of respondents said that they have difficulty paying their heating bills. And we are, of course, talking about the situation where most of the households which are vulnerable also receive some kind of financial support. And even with this financial support, they have the situation where they are unable to cover their heating bills. So this is a very, very relevant from the perspective of how the measures will be addressed and what are the issues that the vulnerable consumers are facing. So there are also other secondary indicators which I have not mentioned here in details, but they are also kind of logical in link to the results of citizens being energy poor. There's the changes in the energy prices. Here are mentioned all the kinds of energy prices for all fuels. These are also the energy expenses in comparison to the income quintile. So of course it's relevant not only the expenditure side but also the income side. There is also the comfortability, coolness. So during summertime, not only if people are feeling adequately warm, but more and more it's relevant whether they are feeling adequately cool. And this is where I would refer back to, if you remember, what it means having adequate energy services, because I would say just 5-10 years ago, we would not consider being adequately cool or comfortably cool during summertime as something that's considered as normal energy service. It would be some kind of luxury to be adequately cool. But with the changes in the way of life and also with the climate change, the cooling demand is getting higher and higher, and dwelling comfortably cool, especially in Southern Europe and Southern Eastern Europe, is becoming one of the relevant indicators of energy poverty. There are also other, like how many numbers per people are they owning the building, because on that, whether someone is owning or renting an apartment or the house they're living in, it's very different how the measures could be implemented, because if there are no split incentives for the owners, they're sometimes not motivated to implement any kind of energy efficiency measures, because everything that's gain from the energy efficiency measures go to the renter. So there is a huge problem that I'm going to mention later on also. And there are some other indicators. For example, excess winter mortality is something that's very much covered from the perspective of data. So this is relevant because the data is gathered regularly by Eurostat. And for example, presence of leak, damp and rot is something that has been directly linked to the illnesses related to energy poverty. For example, presence of damp or rot are directly linked to respiratory or cardiovascular illnesses. But it's harder to collect the data because it has to be collected on field with the adequate energy exam audit in the household. Just a bit about the legislative framework and policies in the European Union. So the energy poverty is mentioned in several legislative frameworks, both in the European Union, but I will say later on in the energy community, whilst energy community is covering it all in one strategy. So European Union has a market design directive which states that member states should define the concept of vulnerable consumers, and that they should define the measures if there is a significant number of vulnerable consumers. So if this concept means that there is a significant number. In electricity directive, there are a lot of let's say definitions on how to set the criteria on to measure energy poverty, to monitor, to report, and they're obliging the member states also to ensure that there will be less disconnections. So there are a lot of alternative alternatives to disconnection, especially if we are considering vulnerable consumers. In the EPBD, so Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, the long-term renovation strategies should also include how the energy poverty will be targeted. And I guess the most important one, the Energy Efficiency Directive in its energy efficiency obligation schemes, it obliges the countries that the obligatory parties for the energy efficiency obligation schemes also take into account the effect on households affected by energy poverty. In the new legislative framework with the Fit for 55, this is getting even stricter to the member states, so they have to directly work with energy poor households, and the measures obligated for energy poor households are now very strict. So there is more and more focus on how to deal with this problem. There is also, of course, in the governance of the Energy Union regulation, the reporting, integrating reporting on all these measures and how the countries are in general dealing with the energy poverty households. There is, of course, there are a lot of evaluation now whether the countries are targeting their energy efficiency, energy poverty measures in their national energy and climate plans. So whether it's recognized, whether there are mechanisms to target it, whether there are models, financial models, and so on. And the results show, you can read more in this paper that has been cited below, but the results show that most of the countries are using some indicators and are mentioning some measures, but not all are covering all of this, let's say, bullet points regarding energy poverty. There are some interesting facts in the EU in general. So there are countries that don't consider energy poverty a specific issue. So they are targeting it as poverty in general. When you look at it, you can see that these are countries that they have in general newer buildings. So their issues with energy poverty are mostly income issues. Then there are countries that are not covering energy poverty in their national energy and climate plans, like Sweden. But with the changes in the European legislative framework, they have to focus also on the national energy and climate plans. Energy poverty in the national energy and climate plans. And there are countries that have energy poverty definitions, like Italy, Austria, Spain, and Cyprus. Others don't, but they use the indicators that had been previously mentioned. So they collect the data, and they are evaluating on the number of the vulnerable consumers. A lot of countries are relying on different EU funding for the energy poor households, and on the long-term renovation strategies, as mentioned in the EPBD, they include energy poverty. Now, something about the energy poverty in the energy community countries. This has been mentioned in the beginning, that there has been a study by Energy Institute, Hrvoje Požan and Dor for energy community. So there are some specificities for the region. These are specific for Western Balkans, but generally for energy community countries. There is a very significant amount of energy inefficient construction as compared to the other European countries, and the low level of thermal insulation of building envelope. And there is a lot of, as I said in the beginning, prevalence of furnace or stove heating. So the one room heating in comparison to central heating. There is an inheritance of the high indoor temperatures due to the fact that the energy has been cheap, and it has been regulated, and still is. The energy prices are still regulated in some of the energy community countries and for some fuels. And there are, in most cases, no possibilities to monitor consumption. There are no rollouts of smart meters. There is no internal monitors, and also a lack of possibility to regulate the consumption. There is also sometimes inadequate institutional capacity, so incapability to find a solution on an institutional level. Low level of economic development, which is of course influencing the income part, but also the measures, and as I said, issues with the regulated prices and non-open markets. And of course, there is a low efficiency level of the whole energy chain, so the great losses from reproduction to consumption, which again influence the final energy. as I said, the energy community has a social strategy which provided the definition of the vulnerable consumers. And this is just an overview, so it's a very comprehensive strategy and defines the uses of energy which do not exceed maximum energy consumption regarding electricity or gas consumption, and they have a low income. Are the ones that are considered energy vulnerable, and most countries in energy community also have part of this definition in their legislative framework in different legislations. On the other side, the conclusion from the authors from the study that has already been mentioned are that most countries lack addressing the broader vulnerable group. They are mostly focusing on the lowest income households of the households who are, that are generally poor. This is also an interesting comparison between the price structure in energy community as compared to EU countries. And you can see here that most EU countries have a very high percentage of the price dedicated to taxes and network prices as compared to energy community prices which are mostly related to energy and exclude taxes, and then there is a smaller percentage of tax. This is relevant as looking at the changes. This would mean that, for example, the prices in the energy community countries with the development of legislative framework could rise with the obligations that the energy community countries have toward either climate change or the vulnerabilities and so on. So also this is the comparison of the indicators. These indicators are inability to keep adequately warm in Serbia and Northern Macedonia. So and compared to some of the EU level countries, and we can see, as was shown in the map previously, that some EU countries like Bulgaria have even worse situation regarding the inability to keep the home adequately warm. But in this case, we also should take into consideration the climate, the different circumstances, and so on. I will show you a bit the insights of the NPOR project, just to try to show this specific situation with the citizens that are living in the rented houses. So this is also very, very specific because I said they are the owners of the houses are not motivated to invest if the situation will not change for them, but only to the renters, to the people who are actually living in the houses. So there is a project that ICP is implementing called NPOR, which has an objective to deepen understanding on poverty policies for the private rented sector, and that monitors dimensions of energy poverty in the private rented sector, and of course supports the implementation of energy efficiency measures for this same sector in some of the member states. And if you're interested in this specific problem, this is also something that you could follow. The findings show that, of course, financial barriers are seen as most important by all of these different stakeholder groups for the implementation of the policies which are related to private rented sector, that there is a lack of policy awareness, but it's not as significant as financial barriers. So we sometimes think that there is a lot of lack of knowledge, but it seems that in this case it's considered not relevant. And they also see national policies as most effective because we are sometimes evaluating whether the policies implemented on regional level or, for example, energy community level would be the most relevant. But then, of course, the national level policies are the most effective level of governance. And some solutions which are considered most relevant, like subsidies, like property tax reductions related to investments in the energy, so that also the owner of the property gets this plus from the energy efficiency, not only the renter. So this is kind of a split incentive to do of them. What is happening next in the legislative framework? So Fit for 55 package which strengthens all these mentioned pieces of legislation, and there are also 5 new. And as I said, the European Commission plans to set up a social climate fund that provides funding for the vulnerable consumers. This social climate fund is linked to the extension of the emission trading scheme to buildings and transport sector, so to cover this gap in higher energy prices. But there are also some announced changes that would have adverse effects to the energy poor households. Besides ETS extension, this is also, for example, introduction of the possible fossil boilers ban, which of course would mean that there should be an alternative way of heating for the vulnerable consumers. We did a recent study for the European Climate Foundation, which will be presented in a few months or weeks rather, so I would not go into details there until it's finalized, but just to say a few words that it is shown very, let's say, in details that the households which are energy poor have around 30% lower energy consumption, which shows that their way of living is probably not adequate, and the thermal comfort and so on. This is the directly quantified, let's say, example of the discomfort of non-adequate energy services. And what is also interesting result of the study is that the imposed policies, for example, ETS2 or minimum energy performance standards, or for example, fossil fuel ban, would bring very much costs to the countries, and in the same time they would bring comfort for the vulnerable groups, but there is a need for a lot of funding from either from the European Union or from national funding or from energy community, depending on the countries, to be able to cover the expenses of this introduction of the new policies. If you're interested in the topic, there are some interesting projects to follow. For example, NPOR, which I mentioned, dealing with energy poverty in rented apartments. Then there's Social Watt, that's very interesting, that's dealing with Article 7 obligations from the Energy Efficiency Directive and how energy poverty is linked to these obligations. There is a project Well-Based, which is dealing with urban planning and public health in the context of energy poverty. So how energy poverty is dealing with the public health, and of course, one also interesting project in PowerMed. You remember I mentioned that there is more and more need for cooling as consider the comfort and adequate social service at the moment. So also this project is dealing with the summer energy poverty, which is becoming more and more relevant, and also dealing with the gender issues, as there are many research showing that the energy poverty, so the more vulnerable groups are, for example, single elderly females, so there is a gender component of the energy poverty also. So there are also many other researches and projects to follow, but I think these are very relevant if you want to know more on the topic.